Okay, I'm just going to do a quick little overview of the build itself before I do thoroughly break it down. As for our weapons, we have the Fungus Pickaxe. Now, these actually do have a Radiant and Inferno-based scaling, and actually do get a lot of poison build up, which is very nice because the withering damage of this actually does get pairs nicely with the poison. Now, as for our spells, you can go a bunch of different ways. I have my own dedicated videos talking about the spells themselves, but being that we have a Radiance and Inferno-based build, we're going to be pairing it along some Umbral-based spells. I like Barrage of Echoes, Latimer's Javelin, and Diminishing Missile is going to be a nice way to debuff some enemies. Now, depending on what area or actually boss you're fighting against will depend on what actually type of weapons you actually pair alongside with these. Now, if you're going up against an area or a boss that actually are weaker to fire damage, I'd recommend going with Seismic Slam and Infernal Weapon. If you're going up against an area or an enemy that actually are weaker to holy damage, I'd recommend going with something like Horus's Judgment or Blessed Reflections as your damaging option. And then obviously you would have the Radiant weapon buff as well. Now this would obviously involve you having to go equip the Charred Root Ring or the Radiant Preeminence Ring, which actually will allow you to cast Radiant or Infernal-based sorceries with an Umbral-based Catalyst, which we have right here, which is going to be the Lost Burescu's Catalyst, however you say that name. Now, as for our other ring, we do have the Bloodbane ring, which actually is going to help us proc Bleed alongside procking the poison. And being that this thing actually gets 150 poison build up is actually extremely good. So you'll proc poison very quickly, and then you just end up procking Bleed on top of that to just make him take even more damage. And as for our pendant, you can go one of two ways. I like to go with the Faceless Carving, makes him take 10%, or you just do 10% more wither damage and just take 10% less wither damage. You can actually go with the Pendant of Burden, which I actually probably recommend going with the boss fight, because every single time that you proc a status effect, you end up just doing 10% more damage, and I'll break down exactly how this works later on. Anyway, time for the thorough breakdown. Getting into the weapons, as I was talking about, the Fungus Pickaxe does actually get a Radiance and Inferno-based scaling, which is actually very unique because not many weapons actually get a pure Radiance and Inferno-based scaling. I actually think this is the only one, and actually does get 150 poison build up as well, which is extremely high, especially paired with that quick moveset that it actually does get. And being that it does get that withering damage, poison is really well paired alongside with that because it just doesn't give him a chance to get that health back. So when using these weapons, being that it doesn't get scalings or requirements in anywhere else, you just go all into your Radiance and Inferno for damage. Now, as for the runes, can go multiple different ways. Now, both of these actually are going to have the Markev equipped in the square slot, which actually does improve the Radiance and Inferno scaling. Now, as for the star-based slot, with the other one, we have the Shun equipped, which actually does improve our elemental damage by roughly, I think it's about 20%, which is going to be very nice because they're mainly doing that withering damage, which does classify as elemental damage. Now, I would like to have two of these, but unfortunately, you can only have one per playthrough. Haven't found another one, so I think you can only get one per playthrough. Now, as for the other one, we have the Balago equipped, which does reduce enemies' physical damage negation when you do actually end up hitting them. Now, from my testing, it actually does stack up roughly like 3 times, and I think it's about 5% more damage negation, or like decreased damage negation every single time. And the debuff does last about 10 seconds. Now, this actually is pretty decent, but unfortunately, we're mainly doing elemental damage, so we're not going to really benefit much off this. But there's not many other ways we can actually go with a star-based rune in this slot. Now, as for our last slot, this is where I kind of wanted to make it tie into the Balago, because I actually ended up going with the Demexis, which does actually improve our physical damage while dual wielding. Now, this actually is a 20% buff, and we have 2 of these and actually will stack, which can result in a lot of damage. But once again, being that we don't really have much physical damage, it's not going to really benefit as much. But with all of these runes actually stacked together and equipped, our physical damage can actually get pretty high, which can be nice because obviously we're mainly doing elemental damage, and if you're going up against enemies or bosses that are more resistant to elemental damage, this can actually be a nice counterpart to that. Now, other ways you actually can go, you can actually equip the Atarix, which actually does increase your poison build-up, but the reason why I didn't really care to go with that is because 150 poison build-up on 2 weapons is still plenty fine. And if you really wanted to, you could actually go double down into the Markev-based rune, because this actually would end up like just stacking together and just end up getting a whole bunch more radiant scaling on top of that. But don't forget, when you're farming for runes, make sure you actually get the Soul Flay finish when you're actually killing an enemy, because I end up just guaranteeing the drop. Okay, now getting into the spells and catalyst. Now, the catalyst of choice is going to be the Lost Burescu's Catalyst. Now, the reason I consider this one to be the best is because not only does it get the best scalings and an A in both in Radiance and Inferno, but you also get 5 whole spell slots, which is obviously going to be extremely beneficial. Just having more spell slots is always good. Now, some of the other catalysts might be better in terms of their base spell power, meaning that can actually be better at earlier game, but I'll still just recommend just committing to the Lost Burescu's Catalyst because you want to save your upgrade materials just to have 2 different weapons be upgraded as well. And once you get to like a certain point in terms of your stat investment, you're just going to benefit way more by actually having this upgraded, because those A scalings are actually really good. Because as you can see, I have 30 Radiance and Inferno, and I get plus 309 spell power, which is honestly insane. Now, as for your spells, once again, I have whole dedicated videos ranking all of the spells, so you can go check those out. But Barrage of Echoes is definitely going to be your best option because this thing just does a whole bunch of damage. Really nice horizontal spread, ridiculous damage. You can just throw it at the ground, try and aim at the enemy and make it explode behind them because it'll just end up doing an enormous amount of damage. Now, you have the Ladder Mesh Javelin as well, which is going to be a very nice projectile. It goes very far. Wrong button. And actually does have a little AoE explosion as well, which is obviously can hit multiple enemies at once, which is really nice. Now, if you did want a cheaper type of projectile, I recommend using something like Umbral Orb or Painful Echo. Now, we do have a Diminishing Missile, which actually does debuff the enemy, make them take 10% more damage, and they'll end up doing 25% less damage to us as well. Now, the buff itself only lasts 15 seconds, but you could just use it at the beginning of the fight and just end up just using your spells to just shred an enemy really quickly. Now, being that we do have a Radiant and Inferno based build, we might as well actually use the Radiant and Inferno based spells. Now, depending on what area or boss that you actually are fighting, will depend on which ones you actually do use. So if you go up against a boss that's weaker to fire damage, I'd recommend just throwing on Seismic Slam because it's just like the best one that it does like ridiculous damage. It is really good and it's fast and it goes very far. Now we actually can put on Infernal Weapon, which is going to be a nice weapon buff. You just add that to your weapon to add more fire damage and actually add some more burn build-up as well. Now, if you go into an area where enemies are more weaker to holy type of damage, then I actually would just recommend using either Oris's Judgment or Blessed Reflection as your damaging option, and obviously just switching to a Radiant weapon to just end up getting a bunch more holy damage and some smite build-up. Now, if you didn't care to do different types of spells, obviously just leave on Umbral Weapon because this one does end up doing a bunch more withering damage, and paired alongside the poison, it'll work really well. But I do recommend using a bunch of the Inferno-based spells, at least the buffs. And I actually don't have anything on this character, but using things like Adir's Hardiness or Adir's Endurance or Adir's Rage, you could actually just use those before the boss fight, and you can actually just switch off the Charred Root Ring and then switch off the spells, and you end up still retaining the buff itself. But speaking of the rings, yes, as I was mentioning, Charred Root Ring or the Ring of Radiant Permanence, depending if you actually want to use the Inferno or Radiance-based spells, you definitely have to have these equipped. Now, if you just wanted to commit to the Umbral-based spells, I would just recommend leaving on the Puissance Root Ring, because it ends up just boosting your spell damage by 10% across the board. Now, the other ring we actually do have equipped here is the Bloodbane Ring. Now, every single time that we proc poison, this ring will just end up proccing bleed for us, for free, basically. And being how quickly we can proc poison is actually going to be really beneficial because they'll just end up taking 10% more damage basically throughout its duration. Now, obviously, you're only going to benefit off this ring if you're actually hitting with the weapons themselves. If you actually want to go more of a spell casting type of build, or you just plan on using your spells more often, or if you go up against an enemy that's actually resist to poison or bleed, I'd recommend just putting on the Mana Stone Ring and putting on the Puissance Root Ring, because both of these things will just end up being very nice for spell damage. Now, as for our pendant, I actually did recommend going with the Faceless Carving as your main and primary option because it'll end up being 10% more wither damage and 10% more wither defenses, which most of our stuff is going to be wither damage, which has benefits throughout. But if you're actually going up against a boss that actually can be poisoned, I would recommend going with the Pendant of Burden, because how this works is for every status effect that you actually do proc upon an enemy, throughout its duration, enemies will end up taking 10% more damage for every single status effect that you have procced. Now, unfortunately, this is only going to work for the status effects with that damage over time effect. So for things like Smite or Ignite that just do burst damage, it's not going to work with those things. For things like Bleed, Poison, Burn, it's definitely going to benefit, which actually do have all of those things active. So ideally, you should be doing 30% more damage, but unfortunately, the bleed that you actually do get off the Bloodbane Ring doesn't actually work with the Pendant of Burden for whatever reason. It actually needs to be the direct source of bleed for it to actually work. But you still can get 20% more damage if you have things like Poison and Burn being active at the exact same time, which having just 20% more damage across the board is obviously going to be better than having the 10% more damage you get from Wither with this type of pendant right here. So if you actually go up against a boss that can be poisoned, I would just recommend leaving this one on. But in almost every other instance, just leave on the Faceless Carving because it'll just end up being better. Okay, so I'm going to show you guys exactly how this build actually does work in some combat. Now, obviously start off just buffing your weapon with whatever buff that you do have. And I would recommend just going with the debuff, which you actually do get here, and just end up making them take 10% more damage, making them do less damage. Now, assume this is actually a boss fight, you'd rather just do it there, or against enemies that actually have larger amounts of health. And at this point, you can either just spam your spells, or just go hard with your light attack combo, and just end up melting them. As you can see, they end up getting proc in the poison straight away. They didn't even get to proc the burn, because they're just getting melted that quickly. But as you can see, they actually proc to the poison now, and every single time they hit them with the withering damage, that would just end up going straight away. So the poisonous pairs very nicely alongside that. Or if you just want to go ahead and just spam your spells, you could actually end up doing that as well. And the spells that you actually do get in Seismic Slam or some of the other options, like the Barrage of Echoes, are extremely powerful, especially Barrage of Echoes. You just recommend just throwing it right on the floor. And as you can see, you just straight up just one-shot them. So yeah, this build is kind of insane. There wasn't really much to showcase. The build just does a lot of damage. Just spam your spells, spam your light attack combos, and you have a great time. If you want to see some other types of builds, whether it be with the Radiance or Inferno-based builds specifically, or Strength or Dexterity, just let me know down in the comments. And yeah, see you guys in the next one. Bye.